Chapter 10. Arthur. Arthur was only halfway dressed for the banquet when he heard a rapping at his window. Puzzled, he ran over to see what it could be, and was surprised to find none other than Archimedes, flapping on the other side, pecking the glass with his beak. Excited, Arthur yanked the window open to let the bird in. "You're back," he exclaimed. "Did you make it to Sir Edgar's castle? Were Merlin's books still there? Did you find something in them? Did you discover what happened to Merlin? Who's Morgan Le Fay?" The owl flew to his perch by Arthur's bed, settling in and carefully picking at his wing feathers before answering. Arthur hopped from foot to foot impatiently. The owl had always had a flair for the dramatic, but this was ridiculous. "Come on," he cried. "I don't have a lot of time before the banquet starts. I need to know what you found out." Archimedes had been gone a week, and Arthur had started worrying something might have happened to him, which would have been horrible. Arthur had admittedly grown pretty fond of him over the last months. Of course he would never admit this to the grumpy old bird, knowing full well Archimedes would never, in turn, admit to appreciating this kind of concern on his behalf. Archimedes spat out a feather. "Yes, I am back," he said grandly, "and let me tell you, I'm very happy to be so. That horrible tower that your foster father had Merlin stay in is so damp and cold and dreary. I don't know how we ever put up with it back in the day." Yes, it's terrible," Arthur agreed peevishly. "But were Merlin's books still there? Were you able to read them?" "Of course I was able to read them," the owl clucked. "What do you think I am, a bumbling medieval idiot? I'm the one who taught you your ABCs, and don't you forget it." Arthur groaned and plopping down on his bed. Clearly, the owl refused to be rushed. Archimedes flew over to join him. "Yes, my impatient boy," he said patronizingly. "I was able to go through Merlin's books. He has quite a lot of them, as you know, which was what made it take so long. But in the end, I did manage to find out quite a bit about your Morgan Le Fay." Arthur sat up in bed. "You did? What did you learn?" The owl frowned. "Unfortunately, it's much worse than we thought. It turns out Morgan Le Fay is a very powerful wizard who practices sorcery of the worst kind. Sorcery you've actually witnessed firsthand, though at the time she was going by another name." Arthur stared at the bird for a moment. Then something suddenly dawned on him. The purple eyes, the purple dress, the purple fingernails. "Madame Mim!" he exclaimed, horrified. "Morgan Le Fay is Madame Mim?" "Give the boy a gold star," Archimedes proclaimed. Then he huffed. "Of course it would have been better had you figured that out when she first showed up at the castle. Would have saved me a lot of draughty nights in that leaky tower." "Sorry," Arthur said. "But she didn't look anything like herself at the time, except for all the purple. She probably shapeshifted, like she did during the wizard duel between her and Merlin." "Yes, quite likely," Archimedes agreed. "She is a master at shape-shifting. The only way to truly tell it's her is by all the purple. She can't quite manage to get rid of that in any shape or form." Arthur shook his head, thinking back to their encounter. If only he'd put two and two together, he could have had her arrested or something. Though she was truly as powerful as Archimedes said, that might not have done any good. "Why do you think she wanted me to go to war with the Saxons?" he asked. "She was very insistent about that." "Right," Archimedes nodded. "Well, from what I've read, Mim, or Morgan, whatever she wants to call herself, is a big fan of the gruesome and grim, and she loves to cause trouble. The more chaotic things become, the more she enjoys them." Arthur considered this. "I guess that makes sense," he said. "She probably thinks a peaceful England is a boring England." "Indeed. And don't think this will be her last attempt. to interfere with your rule.
Oh, I thought you were reading the...
As long as Merlin is away, there's no one to stop her from trying her worst. You must keep on guard and be ready for when she strikes again, likely in a way you least expect it. Please, she's not going to get by me, Arthur declared. I know her tricks now. Her purple color. I'll be ready for her next time she shows up. He jumped off the bed, launching into a few knightly poses to back his claim. Archimedes rolled his eyes. Very scary, he deadpanned. I'm sure she'll be quaking in her purple boots when she sees you coming. She'd better, Arthur declared, grabbing Excalibur and waving it in the air. Or else I'll... Suddenly there was a loud knock at the door, causing Arthur to practically leap out of his skin. Excalibur slipped from his hands and went crashing to the floor. Archimedes snorted. You were saying? He replied drily. Arthur ignored him, pulling the door open and revealing the castle's steward standing on the other side. Oh, it's you, Arthur said, blushing. What is it? Your Majesty, everyone has gathered in the great hall, the steward informed him, giving him a doubtful once-over. It was then that Arthur realized that he was still only half-dressed, including the Saxon king and his men. They are awaiting you to start the feast. Arthur slapped his hand to his forehead. Oh no, I'm late. All right, thank you. I'll be right there. Very good, sir, the castle steward replied, bowing low before closing the door behind him. Once he was gone, Arthur turned to Archimedes. What do I wear? He asked. I want to look kingly for the Saxons. Archimedes groaned loudly but flew over to Arthur's wardrobe and used his beak to open it. He plucked out a red robe with a golden belt. However did you manage while I was gone? He asked, shaking his head. Arthur excitedly grabbed the robe and slipped it over his head. I did great while you were gone, actually, he said, haughtily, cinching the robe with the belt. I made laws. I found a nice round table for my knights to sit at during meetings. Oh, and I even met a girl. I invited her to dinner tonight, too. Archimedes stopped mid-flight, but managed to recover quickly enough to land on his perch instead of the ground. His eyes locked on Arthur. You what? Arthur blushed. Maybe he shouldn't have mentioned that last part. But truth be told, he hadn't been able to concentrate on much else since inviting her earlier that day. Every time he tried to focus on courtly politics, he ended up getting lost in thought, his mind whirring with memories of her dark brown eyes. She works in the kitchen, he explained, as he grabbed his boots and put them on one at a time, not meeting the owl's eyes. Her name is Guinevere. She's really nice. Really nice? Archimedes repeated. Really nice? Is that what they're calling it these days? And you invited her to dinner? Your very important Saxon peace treaty dinner? Yes. The owl shook himself, feathers flying everywhere. This is why I should have never left. You're perfectly incapable of handling it yourself alone. He shook a wing at Arthur. Don't tell me you're in love with her. You can't afford to be in love with anyone. You're far too young. Also, you have an entire kingdom to run, which leaves no room for romance. Don't be ridiculous, Arthur shot back, perhaps with a tad too much defensiveness. I'm not in love with anyone. I just invited her to dinner because she's kind and fun. And I don't have any other friends in this boring old place. Archimedes huffed, ruffling his feathers. No friends? Arthur groaned. You know what I mean, he protested. Human friends, my own age. The owl sighed. I understand, I really do. But Arthur, you can't allow yourself to be distracted, especially now with the Saxons coming tonight for your peace treaty feast. This event may go off without a hitch, without one tiny snag. If these men leave without signing your treaty, your people will see it as a failure on your part. They'll think you don't know how to be king. Well, they wouldn't be entirely wrong, Arthur muttered. Now, boy. What kind of attitude is that? What if Merlin heard you right now? Do you think he'd be approved of you putting yourself down? Now buck up and get down to the feast like the king you are. And with that scolding, the owl took flight straight out the window and into the night. Arthur sighed, watching him go. He knew Archimedes was right. He was getting distracted. Still, it was nice to have one thing in his life that wasn't a total disaster. Between being stuck in the castle, Merlin being missing, and now Madame Mim trying to cause trouble, he had a lot of negatives to deal with. But Guinevere, she was the one shining light in his life, and it would take a lot more than a grumpy, highly educated owl to convince him to smother it. Chapter 11. Sir Edgar. Look at 'em over there, making themselves right at home. Why, I bet not a one of them has had a bath in the last 3 years, maybe longer. Have you smelt them yet? I've had pigs that smelt better. Sir Edgar grunted disapprovingly, elbowing his son Kay to get his attention. Kay was sitting beside him in the banquet hall, gnawing on a turkey leg. He rolled his eyes at his dad. Whatever, he said, his mouth full. Whatever, Sir Edgar snorted. I'll show you whatever. This isn't right, I tell you, and the wart should know it. Did we teach him nothing at all during his time at our castle? He doesn't even know how to properly wash dishes, Kay muttered. How can you expect him to run a country? Sir Edgar sighed loudly, his eyes scanning the castle's great hall, which was decked out to within an inch of its life and packed to the gills with nobles and knights from around England, sitting at long tables lined up in rows across the room. Each table was covered in mountains of food, choice meats and fine cheeses and delectable roast pheasant, piled high and almost overflowing their platters. They had even put out some sugared dates and almonds, rare delicacies, usually saved for very important guests. Instead, they were serving the Saxons, barbarians from across the sea who had been nothing but trouble for England ever since Rome had left and taken their armies with them, leaving the country basically defenseless. War chiefs from different regions had tried to take on the problem, but could never seem to stop fighting one another in order to unite against their common enemy. At the time, it seemed England would be destined to fall to foreign rule. Then King Uther had come, a vicious war chief who had never lost on the battlefield and yet was charismatic enough to convince the smaller lords to join his realm. Once he'd reunited England, he'd taken on the Saxons with brutal force, letting them know in no uncertain terms how unwelcome they were in his country. Let's just say they hadn't been a problem since, until now, until England decided to put a child on the throne. Sir Edgar huffed, infuriated all over again. This was all Hobbs' fault. If only the man had not suddenly come down with the mumps, Edgar would have never been forced to take the scrawny little orphan to London instead, to serve as Kay's squire. And if the wart had been in London, he'd never have even seen the sword in the stone. Never mind have had a chance to pull it out. The tournament would have been held as promised, with the strongest knight being awarded the throne. Why, at this moment, Kay could have been their king. Instead, it was the insufferable wart wearing the crown, which didn't even fit him properly. Sure, at first Edgar had believed the whole thing was some kind of miracle, just like everyone else, a gift from the heavens, the promised king, delivered to them at long last. He'd even bowed before Ward as if he were some long-lost hero, come to save them all. But ever since that day, he'd started to have his doubts on the whole matter, especially since it was clear Ward had no idea what he was doing. The heavens must have made a mistake, and now Wart was making a much worse one, trying to befriend England's enemies. Luckily, Edgar had a plan, a good plan, a plan to show everyone here, especially those filthy Saxons, that while Wart might have been able to pull a sword from a stone, he had no idea how to use it. He turned to Kay. "Are you ready for this?" he asked, grabbing the turkey leg from his son's hand and tossing it back on his plate. Kay gave his father a sulky look. "I said I was, didn't I?" Sir Edgar slapped Kay on the back. "Of course you did, my son, and it's going to be great. A historic event the bards will sing for years to come." He smiled widely, chuckling to himself as he tried to imagine the Wart's face when it all went down, when he went down, and Edgar would become father to the King of England. Chapter 12. Arthur. Presenting His Majesty, Arthur, King of England. Arthur squirmed a little as the herald called out his name, his voice ringing through the great hall, as loud as a trumpet. As Arthur stepped into the room, his ears were further assaulted by spontaneous cheering from his guests. Shouts of "Hail, King Arthur!" and "Long live the King!" resounded through the large space as he made his way through the room to the king's table, which had been set on a raised platform at the very front. He never understood why they forced kings to sit on a stage to eat, as if they were part of an actor's show. But the constant scrutiny did remind him to always chew with his mouth closed. He climbed up on the platform, scanning the room. All eyes seemed to be on him, their expressions expectant. At first, he wasn't sure if they wanted him to make some kind of speech, something he was not exactly prepared to do. But then he noticed none of the food on the tables had been touched. In fact, the only person he could see eating was Kay, who was gnawing on a huge turkey leg, chewing with his mouth wide open. Everyone else was sitting patiently in front of empty plates. Had they all been sitting waiting for him to start eating? Ugh. Sorry I'm late, he stammered. "Please, help yourself to the food. There's, plenty to go around." Fortunately, that seemed to serve as speech enough, and everyone turned excitedly to the bounty before them. Soon the room was filled with a cacophony of banging plates and animated conversation. Everyone eating and drinking and chatting among themselves. Arthur sat down at his table, relieved to no longer be the focus of everyone's attention. It was then that he wondered where Guinevere was. A quick scan of the hall told him she was not present. Had she decided against coming after all? A wave of disappointment washed over him, even as he tried to push it away. He tried to remind himself of Archimedes' warning. This was an important dinner. He couldn't be distracted. But still, he had to admit, he had been looking forward to seeing her again. He had just started to help himself to food when the door to at the back of the great hall opened. A lone figure stepped shyly into the room. It took Arthur a moment to realize it was Guinevere. She was dressed so differently than when he'd seen her earlier that day, or in the forest by the well. Now she wore a long sky blue gown with bell sleeves and a simple silver sash. Her once flowing blonde hair had been tied up in a series of complicated braids, framing her head like a crown. Excitedly, Arthur stood up and waved from his platform. She met his eyes, her own widening in disbelief as he beckoned her forwards. As she took a few cautious steps in his direction, it seemed like everyone in the room turned to stare, wondering what had captured the king's attention. But when Gwyn noticed their eyes, instead of cowering in embarrassment, a mischievous grin spread across her face, and she began to dance wildly down the aisle as if to lively music. When she reached the stage, she leapt up onto the platform, then turned to the guests, giving them a saucy bow. The room broke out into whoops and cheers. Gwen turned to Arthur, giving him an impish smile. He laughed and clapped along with the other guests. "You're a pretty good dancer," he remarked as she settled down in the chair next to him. "I wish I could make an entrance like that." "It's not hard. I'll teach you," she told him, grabbing a plate and helping herself to some of the meat. All eyes were still on her, but she was looking only at Arthur. "This is quite a feast," she remarked as she sampled a sugar date. "I don't think I've ever seen so much food in one place in my entire life." "It is a bit much, honestly," Arthur confessed. "I had no idea when I asked them to prepare it that this is what they'd come up with." "At least there will be a lot of leftover food to share with the people in town tomorrow." "You're going to share your food with the people?" Guinevere looked surprised. "Well, yes. It's better than having it go to waste, isn't it?" Arthur replied with a shrug. "And why shouldn't they enjoy it? They're part of our kingdom, too. I want them to know that they matter." Guinevere's face took on a peculiar look. She dropped her eyes, concentrating on her food. Arthur wondered if he'd said something wrong. But then, what would she want him to do? Hoard the good food in the castle and allow the people to go without? That didn't seem very kingly to him. "By the way, you look really nice," he blurted out, feeling the need for a subject change. She looked up, her cheeks flushing. "When I told Mistress McGreedy I'd been invited to dinner, she insisted on finding me something proper to wear. Seems my everyday kitchen rags don't cut it in court. This monstrosity of a dress once evidently belonged to the great and lovely Lady Igraine, who lived here many years before." She made a gesture putting on the airs of a grand lady. Then she laughed. "To be honest, it's dreadfully itchy, and I can't wait to be rid of it." Arthur nodded knowingly. "I know exactly how you feel," he confessed, "and I'll never understand it. Why, these clothes cost so much. You would think they'd be required to make them comfortable to wear." "Exactly. There ought to be a law." "Hey, maybe you can make one," she joked. "You are the king, after all. Might as well get something out of the job." "That's a good idea." Arthur squared his shoulders, shooting her a look of mock authority. "I declare from this day henceforth, all clothes in the kingdom must be made comfortable, on penalty of death." Guinevere clapped her hands. Arthur made a short bow. He was already glad he invited Guinevere to dinner. She brought a spark of life to the dreadfully boring court. He opened his mouth to say something more, but at that moment they were approached by Sir Pellinore and a man in chain mail whom Arthur didn't recognize. The knight bowed before his king, then straightened. "My lord, I'd like to introduce you to King Baldemar," Pellinore said, gesturing to the visitor. "He is king of the Saxons, and was the one who agreed to come and join your feast this eve." "Oh!" Arthur swallowed hard. So this was the invading king. He looked tall, and pretty muscular, too. He had curly black hair on his head and a thick, ugly scar cutting across his left cheek, the mark of a true warrior. Arthur glanced down at his own skinny, gangly body and felt suddenly awkward, like a child playing dress-up in his father's clothes. No, he couldn't think like that. He had to play the part, or this wasn't going to work. He had to act like he had been born into this role with full confidence. He could not let King Baldemar see a hint of weakness or fear, or else that chaos Mims wanted so badly, it would become inevitable. "You are most welcome, your grace," he said, giving a small bow of respect to the other king. "I am pleased to make your acquaintance and delighted to welcome you to my kingdom. Thank you for accepting my invitation." "Wow, That sounded pretty good, actually, he thought after he had spoken. Maybe he could make this work. The burly king gave him a crooked smile. How could I not come? He asked with a wink. Everyone in the land is talking about the miracle boy king. Of course I had to see him for myself. Arthur felt his cheeks heat at this, but forced himself to keep his eyes on the man and not look away. And now you've seen me, and my court. What do you think? I think it's quite a merry place, Your Grace, Valdemar replied with a smile. I will be honest. Most of my men didn't agree with my decision to come here. They thought it might be a trap. We came fully expecting we could be met by swords and arrows. He gestured out to the room. Instead, you feed us and give us respect. It's not something we're used to from the English, if you pardon my saying. Of course, Arthur replied, feeling secretly pleased. His plan was working. I have no quarrel with you. As long as you keep in your own lands, I think we can agree to live in peace. He paused and added, and perhaps even take things a step farther if you're willing. What are you proposing? Valdemar looked interested. We agree to become allies, meaning we help one another out. If you need food or medicine, you can call on us, and we will give it to you. Or, if we need an army to protect our shores, you will send your vast fleet of ships to lend us aid. King Valdemar looked surprised. For a moment, he said nothing. Then he nodded slowly. This is an interesting proposal, he said. I will think on it this eve. If it pleases you, I will give you my answer tomorrow morning, after I speak with my men. That's fair, Arthur said, just happy Valdemar hadn't laughed in his face at his idea. Kay had claimed the Saxons were barbarians, but they actually seemed quite reasonable. I will eagerly await your response, he added, then waved his hand. But for now, please enjoy yourself in the feast. Sit by my side if you like. You are my personal guest, after all. He gestured to the empty place to his left. I thank you, Your Majesty, but I prefer, to sit with my men, if that's all right with you. They might not like me putting on airs sitting on stages. He laughed good-naturedly. Oh, yes, of course, Arthur replied with a grin. Believe me, I don't like sitting up here much either. I feel like I should be putting on a show. The king laughed again, slapping Arthur on the shoulder. I like you, boy king, he said. I think you and I may be able to work something out. The king returned to his men at the table, and Arthur turned back to his plate, feeling flushed with pleasure. This had gone better than he'd imagined, and in front of the whole court, too. Now everyone could see his plan wasn't as bad as some of them had wanted to make it out to be. As he lifted a slice of pheasant to his mouth, he felt eyes at his side. He turned to see Guinevere watching him, another strange expression on her face. He cocked his head in question. What? He asked. Don't tell me I just did all that with food in my teeth. No, she smiled and shook her head. No, your teeth are fine. Then, what is it? She shrugged. Oh, nothing. I'm just surprised, I guess. Most kings would not be as generous as you were just now. Arthur considered this for a moment. I suppose not. But then none of them studied under Merlin. Guinevere's smile faded, just for a moment. Arthur wondered why. Do you know Merlin? She asked. No, she said quickly. Maybe too quickly. I mean, I've heard of him, obviously. Everyone has. But I've never had the pleasure to meet him. Her face looked pinched all of a sudden, as if she smelt something bad. Well, if he ever comes back, I'll introduce you, Arthur declared. You'll love him, I promise. He's so smart, and he's an amazing wizard, too. He taught me everything I know. Does he tell you what to do? Guinevere asked, suddenly looking very interested. Like how to run the land? Does he give you advice, orders? Arthur frowned, confused at her questioning. Well, no, he said. To be honest, I haven't seen or heard from him in ages. Not since before I came to London and pulled the sword from the stone. He hung his head, remembering. We had a fight, you see, and he flew off to some place called Bermuda. I wish he'd come back. I don't like doing all this without him. I feel like I'll make a wrong choice or something, and someone will get hurt. Guinevere pursed her lips for a moment. You seem to be doing pretty well without him, she ventured, her voice hesitant. I mean, all of this, she gestured to the room. This was all you, right? Not anything to do with Merlin. I suppose, but Arthur was interrupted by a sudden commotion in the hall. When he looked out to see what it could be, his jaw dropped in surprise as his eyes fell on Kay, storming up to the stage. His foster brother's eyes were narrowed, and his hands were clenched into fists. Arthur's heart quickened, though he wasn't quite sure why. What, was his foster brother going to complain about his treaty with the Saxons again? If so, he was choosing a very poor time to do it. Kay, Arthur tried as his foster brother stepped up to the table, glaring down at him. If looks could kill, Arthur was quite sure he'd be on the floor. Is something wrong? Kay scowled. He glanced back at his father, who was watching with far too much interest for Arthur's comfort. Sir Edgar waved his hand at his son, urging him on. Kay huffed, then turned back to Arthur. Is something wrong? Kay growled. I'll tell you what's wrong. This farce had gone on long enough. You were never meant to be our king.